George Washington is arguably the most famous American who ever lived. Every child in America learns about George Washington from an extremely young age, and ironically, this fame almost makes the man less dynamic and interesting. When most kids think of Washington, they think of the portrait you see on the $1 bill, the man in his older years as president. What people should realize is that Washington the man was basically a real-life superhero during his era. Standing over 6 feet tall, weighing over 200 pounds, an unusual size during that period, he was a mountain of a man who was a legend in his own time. Sure, there are many tales of George Washington that have been embellished over time and grown into legend, but there are also many, many true stories that are so wild they're almost hard to believe. Today, we're going to look at a few of the most famous tales where George Washington overcame what looked to be near certain death. Was Washington America's first president invincible? Maybe. There's some evidence that Washington himself believed this, and certainly people in the late 18th century believed it as well. Our first tale of George Washington overcoming what could have been death takes us back to 1751. The only time that George Washington ever left what became the United States was on this trip when he accompanied his older brother Lawrence Washington to Barbados in the Caribbean. Lawrence was suffering from tuberculosis and traveled to a tropical environment to try to ease his pain and recover. During this trip, 19-year-old George Washington contracted smallpox. On average, smallpox had a fatality rate of about 30%. So can you imagine if young George Washington had passed away at this moment? Perhaps the American Revolution never even occurs, or if it does, the country doesn't have Washington's leadership to guide it to victory. Washington's survival of the smallpox that he contracted in Barbados was a stroke of luck for the future United States. His brother Lawrence wasn't as lucky, as he passed away from the tuberculosis the following year. Our second story takes us to 1753, when 21-year-old George Washington led an expedition at the orders of Virginia Governor Dinwiddie to address a claim that the French were trespassing on British land. Washington kept a journal during this expedition, which was later published throughout the colonies and in Great Britain. This journal made the young Washington somewhat of a celebrity, and during this expedition, Washington also escaped what looked to be possible death. Following the French telling Washington that they would not remove themselves from the land that the British believed that they were trespassing on, Washington and his party made their way back to Virginia. On Saturday, December 29th, 1753, Washington and his guide, Christopher Gist, reached the partially frozen Allegheny River. The fact that it was partially frozen is key to this story, as the two believed that the river was going to be fully frozen, making it easier to cross. Instead, there was rushing water that had chunks of ice. So Gist and Washington spent most of the day constructing a raft made of logs. They only had one hatchet to build this. After sunset on December 29th, Gist and Washington attempted to cross the river. They moved through the partially frozen river and ice-clogged water. Ultimately, their raft jammed up against a pack of ice. Washington tried to move the ice away, but the current was strong. Washington lost his balance and he fell into the icy waters. He ended up pulling himself back on the raft with the assistance of Gist. Had Washington been carried away in that partially frozen Allegheny River on that day, the entire history of the United States would have been changed. Our next story of George Washington escaping death takes us to the summer of 1754 and the beginning of what became the French and Indian War. On May 28th, 1754, 22-year-old George Washington made a fateful decision when he and his men ambushed a French unit of soldiers at Great Meadows in present-day Fayette County, Pennsylvania. During this ambush, the French commander Jumonville was killed. Just weeks later, on July 3rd, 1754, the French returned the favor when they attacked George Washington at his fort, Fort Necessity, out of revenge. In order to end the battle, Washington ended up signing articles of capitulation via the French, which were written in the French language. Washington had the articles hastily translated to him when he signed it. Unknown to Washington, within the articles was the term assassination, which was used to describe what had happened to the French general Jumonville in the prior incident at Great Meadows. Washington acknowledging that the French general had been assassinated was cause for war between the French and the British. Washington claimed throughout the rest of his life that he had no idea that that term was in the Articles of Capitulation. Even so, this battle at Fort Necessity could have resulted in disaster. Certainly the French had every reason to be out for revenge after the death of Jumonville, and it wouldn't have surprised anybody had they targeted Washington in the attack. Instead, Washington was granted the ability to return to Virginia alive. For his part, Washington seemed thrilled by the danger. He wrote to his brother John Augustine Washington on May 31st, following the skirmish with the French at Great Meadows. Quote, "I can with truth assure you, I heard bullets whistle, and believe me, there was something charming in the sound." The legend of George Washington and his inability to be killed on the battlefield was starting to grow. Fast forward to July 9th, 1755, the French and Indian War is well underway, and young George Washington is now at the side of British General Edward Braddock and his expedition through the Ohio country to take French Fort Duquesne. What ensued on July 9th was the Battle of the Monongahela. During this battle, the British and the colonials encountered the French and their Canadian and Indian allies just southwest of Fort Duquesne. During the battle, General Braddock was wounded and ultimately died of those wounds, and it was left to young George Washington to organize a retreat and save the lives of all of the men that he could as the British lost the battle. Washington had been struggling with dysentery in the days prior to the battle. In fact, he was unable to ride his horse for periods of the march through the Ohio Territory. But on this day, he was back on horseback, and despite bullets whistling past him, Washington was able to save the lives of legions of men. After the battle, the legend of George Washington grew. Miraculously, Washington lived through this battle despite having 2 horses shot out from underneath him, and according to Washington, 4 bullets through his coat and even a bullet in his hat. Yet his body was unscathed. In a letter to his brother John Augustine Washington on July 18th, 1755, Washington wrote, quote, "By the all-powerful dispensations of Providence, I have been protected beyond all human probability and expectation, for I had 4 bullets through my coat and 2 horses shot out under me, yet escaped unhurt, although death was leveling my companions on every side." When people started hearing about this event throughout the colonies, you can understand why people thought that Washington indeed was protected by divine providence, and it wouldn't be hard to understand why Washington himself possibly believed it himself. Now, there were certainly other events throughout the American Revolution where Washington could have been killed, yet he lived. When Washington and his men crossed the Delaware River on Christmas night, 1776, during a blizzard, surely there was grave danger in front of them as they made their way to Trenton. That battle would be the first time Washington himself led his men into combat during the American Revolution, and he followed that up not too long later by personally leading his men into the Battle of Princeton, reportedly just 30 yards from firing weapons. The general put himself in danger, yet came out unscathed. Now, there are all kinds of legends about Washington and whether or not he was targeted for assassinations, or even back at the Battle of Monongahela, if the American Indians themselves personally were attempting to kill Washington. There's a well-known tale called the Indian Prophecy, which Mount Vernon themselves write about on their website. Quote, "The Indian Prophecy is a legend told about George Washington's miraculous survival at the Battle of the Monongahela and a subsequent encounter he had with an indigenous chief. A variant version is sometimes known as the Bulletproof President. The tale is credited to Washington's doctor and friend James Craik, and the fullest version was published by Washington's step-grandson George Washington Parke Custis in the 1820s. Custis's telling recalls that during a 1770 trip to what is now West Virginia, Craik and Washington encountered an Indian chief who had fought against them during the Battle of the Monongahela on July 9th, 1755. The chief revealed that during the fight, he had ordered his men to kill Washington, but that all their shots had missed. He declared that a power mightier far than we shielded Washington from harm. He then predicted that Washington would become the chief of nations, and a people yet unborn will hail him as the founder of a mighty empire. The core of the story is one that has been in circulation since at least 1800. The historical truth of the story, however, is harder to discern. Like many stories about Washington, it likely contains a kernel of truth, but has been subject to embellishment and exaggeration over time. So, was George Washington invincible? Was he personally protected by God? That's up for you to decide. But one thing is true. Our nation's first president lived through certain death on more than one occasion. And if things had gone differently just once, just one time during one of those events, this country may not exist.